David stood at the entrance of the Intergalactic Military Academy, a tiny figure in comparison to the immense alien structures surrounding him. The Academy, built on a hollowed-out asteroid at the edge of Federation space, towered with gleaming spires, vast hangars, and training fields that seemed to stretch on endlessly. He clutched the single duffel bag containing his few personal belongings and adjusted the sleek silver uniform that marked him as a new recruit. He took a deep breath before stepping forward, knowing all eyes were on him. Hundreds of alien cadets, representing dozens of different species, gathered in the sprawling courtyard. Each one was more imposing than the last. Muscles, claws, scales, and armor made of organic materials he couldn't even name. Many of the species here had evolved for war. The Academy had only one goal: to forge soldiers for the coming conflict with the Zorak, a hive-minded insectoid species that had been terrorizing the galaxy for decades. David was one of the few humans to ever be accepted into the Academy. Humanity was a young race in galactic terms, still rebuilding after centuries of internal conflict on Earth. They were technologically advanced, yes, but physically unimpressive. The Galactic Federation had been hesitant to allow human recruits, seeing them as too weak and too fragile for the brutal, interstellar warfare the Academy prepared soldiers for. He knew this. He also knew that walking through those gates made him a target. As he passed through the crowd of towering, alien recruits, he heard the low murmur of voices rise around him. Snickers. Scoffs. An unmistakable tension filled the air, and David could feel eyes on his back. Suddenly, a booming voice called out. Well, look what we have here." The voice came from behind him. David turned to see K'Elerin, the Zeltar giant, standing with a smug grin on his face. He was everything the Academy seemed to value in a recruit, over 7 feet tall, with a body covered in a thick, armored hide. His skin was dark gray and ridged like ancient stone, and his eyes glowed faintly with a piercing yellow light. K'Elerin was a natural-born warrior, and he knew it. The other recruits began to gather around, eager to see the show. "I thought humans were good at one thing," K'Elerin said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Running. Maybe you're in the wrong place, human. Shouldn't you be training for marathons instead of wars?" A ripple of laughter echoed through the crowd. David felt the heat rising in his face, but forced himself to stay calm. He wasn't about to take the bait. "Hey, I hear they're good at hiding too," a Thraxian recruit chimed in. The Thraxian had an insectoid body with razor-sharp mandibles clicking in amusement. "Maybe he can hide behind us while we do the real fighting." David's fists clenched at his sides, but he didn't rise to the provocation. He had trained for this moment, mentally preparing for months, knowing the ridicule would come. These recruits saw him as nothing more than a frail, soft-skinned outsider. To them, he was a joke, a mistake, an experiment that didn't belong. But David wasn't here for their approval. He had a plan. He was here to win the war, even if no one else believed he could. The Academy's instructors, tall figures wrapped in dark cloaks with glowing visors, watched from a distance. They didn't intervene. The Academy was not a place for fairness or mercy, it was survival of the fittest. If David wanted to make it here, he'd have to prove himself, and no one was going to hold his hand. K'Elerin stepped closer, his massive shadow falling over David. "You'll never make it through the first week, human. You'll be begging to go back to your planet. If you can even survive the first training session." David looked up, meeting K'Elerin's eyes. "We'll see." K'Elerin blinked in surprise. He had expected fear, maybe submission. Instead, David's calm response seemed to throw him off balance. The smug expression faded slightly, replaced with irritation. He clearly wasn't used to a human standing up to him. "Don't worry," K'Elerin said, stepping back. "I'll be there to watch you fail." The other recruits dispersed, the momentary entertainment over, though the air remained thick with tension. David took a deep breath and continued toward the dormitories. The academy was designed for war, not camaraderie, and he knew that the alien recruits weren't just testing his will, they were determining his worth. Once inside the sterile, metal confines of his quarters, David sat on the edge of his bunk, staring at the wall. His hands were still shaking with the adrenaline from the confrontation, but he forced himself to steady his breathing. The loneliness hit him all at once. Back home, his family had told him not to come. They had pleaded with him not to throw his life away in a war that wasn't his to fight. But David had made up his mind. He needed to be here. He closed his eyes, remembering the devastation the Zorak had left in their wake. The images of burning cities and shattered spaceports flashed through his mind, the destruction of entire human colonies in the outer reaches of the galaxy. The Zorak were relentless, a force that devoured everything in their path, and the Federation had been fighting them for decades. But their tactics were failing. The war was reaching a critical point, and David knew the Federation needed something new. Something unpredictable. He had a secret, one that no one at the Academy knew about yet. Humanity had developed a new kind of weapon, something the Zorak hive mind couldn't anticipate. David had spent years preparing for this, not just physically but mentally. He had studied the Zorak, learned everything he could about their hive-based strategies. And he knew that brute strength wasn't going to win this war. As he sat in the dimly lit room, the sounds of alien recruits training and laughing in the distance, David steeled himself for what was to come. Tomorrow, the real training would begin, and he had no doubt that Aaron and the others would be waiting for him to fail. But David was used to being underestimated. He had learned to turn that into his greatest advantage. He wasn't here to prove himself to them, he was here to change the course of the war. And no amount of mockery or alien superiority would stop him. Tomorrow, they would all see. The Intergalactic Military Academy's war games were the ultimate test, a full-scale simulation of the battlefield meant to push recruits to their absolute limits. No one ever knew when the games would begin, only that when the alarms blared, they would have to be ready for anything. For weeks, David had trained in silence, enduring the constant taunts and mockery from his alien peers. He knew his time would come. And when the blaring alarms echoed through the academy halls at dawn, he knew that time was now. David rolled out of bed and snapped into his battle armor with the efficiency of a soldier who had practiced this moment 100 times. His armor was sleek and compact, designed for mobility rather than raw defense, a stark contrast to the heavy plating worn by many of the alien recruits. The war games weren't just about brute strength, they were about tactics, survival, and adaptation. The recruits gathered in the central hangar, where a holographic map of the battlefield hovered over the ground. It was a massive, simulated environment with rugged terrain, deep valleys, fortified bases, and countless obstacles. The academy instructors stood to the side, their faceless visors glowing dimly as they surveyed the new batch of soldiers. David quickly glanced around the crowd, noting the confidence exuding from the larger, more imposing recruits. Aaron was at the center, laughing with his group as they eyed the battlefield with anticipation. His armor gleamed, almost as though he expected to march through the games without a single scratch. The briefing was short and to the point. The objective: capture the enemy command post and defend your own. The recruits were split into 4 teams: Alpha, Beta, Delta, and Gamma. David was assigned to Gamma, the most diverse group of aliens, but also the least coordinated. He had overheard the other recruits calling them the Misfit Squad, a team of outliers from different species that didn't mesh well. Naturally, no one wanted the human on their team, so Gamma was the default choice for him. Aaron, of course, was on Alpha, heavily favored to win. His team was a collection of the Academy's strongest and most skilled recruits, all of whom followed his lead without question. The competition wasn't going to be easy. Alpha was expected to steamroll through the other teams, and Aaron had already made it clear he was looking forward to humiliating David once again. As the countdown to the start of the war games began, David stood quietly at the edge of his team, taking in the dynamics. The others were already bickering about strategy, unable to agree on a plan. The team's leader, a broad-shouldered alien with blue, bioluminescent skin named Jiro, tried to give orders, but no one was listening. They were a mess, just as David had predicted. The timer hit 0. The simulation began with a flash of light as the holographic terrain materialized around them. The recruits were instantly transported to their designated starting points on opposite sides of the battlefield. David's heart raced as he surveyed the area around him: jagged mountains, thick forests, and a river cutting through the center. It was a harsh landscape, but his mind was already working, mapping out possibilities. The rest of Team Gamma scattered in different directions, each recruit seemingly eager to prove themselves without any sense of coordination. David sighed and watched as Jiro tried to rally them, but it was no use. They weren't listening. If this continued, Gamma would be easy prey for Alpha. David slipped away from the group, unnoticed as usual, and made his way toward the far flank of the battlefield. While the others focused on the front lines, he had something different in mind. The war games weren't about individual glory, they were about seizing the objective. And in his quiet observation, David had noticed something crucial: no one was paying attention to the terrain. The Academy's simulations were advanced, but they weren't perfect. David had spent weeks studying the Academy's systems during his off hours, learning how they functioned. There were weaknesses in the programming, small glitches that no one else seemed to notice. He made his way to a small outpost hidden in the mountains, far from the main battle zone. Inside, he found a tactical terminal linked to the battlefield's energy grid. David quickly began working on the terminal, hacking into the grid with the knowledge he'd quietly gathered. The interface was complex, designed for advanced alien species, but he was prepared. With every keystroke, he accessed more of the simulation systems. His goal wasn't to cheat, it was to outthink the opposition. He rerouted power from the enemy's defensive shields, lowering their energy output just enough that they wouldn't notice immediately. He disabled several of the automated turrets around Alpha's command post, creating gaps in their defenses. The most critical move was overriding the communication relays, which gave him access to Alpha's tactical grid. With this, he could track KLRN's team movements in real time. As he worked, David could hear the distant sounds of battle: the energy blasts, the roars of alien soldiers clashing in the simulated valley below. He checked his team's progress on the grid. As expected, Gamma was floundering. Most of them had been picked off by Alpha and Beta, their lack of coordination and discipline costing them dearly. But that was about to change. David moved quickly, using the terminal to disable a section of Alpha's shields just as they engaged Beta in heavy combat. KLRN's team was pushing forward, using brute force as usual, but their defenses were suddenly weaker than expected. The automated turrets that should have protected their flank were offline, and Beta's forces broke through the gap. Confusion spread through Alpha's ranks as they fought to hold the line. KLRN roared in frustration as his team was thrown off balance. David watched from a distance, his eyes scanning the battlefield as his strategy began to take shape. With Alpha distracted and their command post exposed, he sent a covert message to Jiro through the terminal, outlining a route for the remaining Gamma recruits to take. Jiro hesitated at first, but after realizing his own plan had failed, he reluctantly followed David's instructions. While Alpha was preoccupied with Beta, Jiro and a small group of Gamma recruits slipped through the weakened defenses David had orchestrated. They made their way toward Alpha's command post, encountering minimal resistance. By the time KLRN and his squad realized what was happening, it was too late. David smirked as he watched the simulation's endgame unfold. The remaining members of Team Gamma stormed Alpha's command post, capturing it with ease. The war games ended abruptly, the battlefield dissolving as the holographic terrain disappeared. The recruits found themselves back in the Academy's central hangar, where the instructors waited silently. KLRN, still breathing heavily from the intense battle, looked around in disbelief. His team had dominated most of the games, yet somehow, they had lost. How? K.L. Aaron growled, his glowing eyes locking onto Jiro. You? How did you dash? Jiro opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, K.L. Aaron's eyes shifted to David, standing quietly at the back of the group. Recognition flickered across K.L. Aaron's face, and his expression twisted into anger. You! K.L. Aaron stormed toward David, towering over him. You didn't even fight. You hid like a coward and cheated your way to victory. David didn't flinch. He stared up at the Zeltar warrior, his calm gaze unwavering. I didn't cheat. I played the game. You dash. K.L. Aaron raised his fist, but one of the instructors, a towering figure with dark robes and glowing red eyes, stepped forward. Enough. The instructor's voice was deep and commanding, silencing the room. The war games are a test of strategy, not brute strength. Gamma's victory was legitimate. K.L. Aaron scowled but lowered his fist, his pride clearly wounded. David held his ground, his face unreadable. The mockery from before had faded, replaced by a heavy silence. The other recruits stared at him, some with curiosity, others with disbelief. He could feel their judgment, but it didn't matter. The war games had proven one thing: strength alone wasn't enough to win. As the crowd dispersed, David walked back to his quarters, his mind already turning to the next challenge. He knew this victory wouldn't change the way the other recruits saw him overnight, but it was a start. The real war was still ahead, and David had every intention of being ready when it came. For now, though, he allowed himself a small, quiet victory. The moment of victory in the war games felt distant, almost irrelevant now. David stood at the command post on Halos 9, staring out over the barren landscape, where thick, crimson clouds hung low over the horizon, casting an eerie light across the battlefield. The war had arrived in full force, and this was no longer a simulation. This was real. Halos 9 was a vital outpost for the Galactic Federation, a communications hub connecting the far reaches of the galaxy. If it fell to the Zorak, a vast section of the Federation's defensive network would collapse, leaving entire sectors vulnerable to invasion. The planet was cold, desolate, and largely uninhabitable, a wasteland of sharp rocks and poisonous air. It wasn't a place anyone would want to fight for, but for the Federation, it was critical. David's unit had been deployed there just weeks after the war games ended. The camaraderie that might have grown from their shared experience in the games had dissolved the moment they landed on Halos 9. The real war had stripped away any sense of competition or pride. This was survival, plain and simple. The Zorak were relentless. The insectoid species swarmed in vast numbers, their tactics driven by a hive mind that made them terrifyingly efficient. Their forces never tired, never faltered, and never stopped coming. Every day brought another wave, and every night was filled with the echoes of their screeches and the hum of their bioweapons, a constant reminder that death was always near. David had been placed in a forward reconnaissance unit, alongside the same alien recruits who had once mocked him. K.L. Aaron, Jiro, the Thraxian sniper, and a few others from Team Gamma were now his comrades in arms. The hatred and tension that had once defined their relationships had given way to a grim, reluctant respect. They didn't have to like each other anymore. They just had to survive. David checked his wristcom, bringing up a map of the surrounding area. The Zorak had been probing the perimeter for days, looking for weaknesses. He knew they were planning something big. The central hive ship hovered in orbit above Halos 9 like a dark, twisted shadow. The Zorak always attacked in cycles, and this pattern suggested an imminent full-scale assault. K.L. Aaron approached from behind, his heavy footsteps making the ground tremble slightly. The Zeltar warrior had changed in the weeks since the war games. His arrogance had faded, replaced by a hardened, battle-scarred resolve. The loss in the games had wounded his pride, but real war had made him humble. "You see anything?" K.L. Aaron asked, his voice gruff and tired. "Not yet," David replied, scanning the horizon. "But they're coming. Soon." K.L. Aaron grunted. They always are. David couldn't argue with that. The Zorak attacked with terrifying frequency, and each wave was worse than the last. Their hive mind allowed them to adapt, learning from each battle, becoming more efficient, more deadly. The Federation forces had been holding on, barely, but David knew they couldn't last much longer without reinforcements. His mind worked tirelessly, analyzing every detail, every movement of the enemy. The others often joked that David never slept, and in truth, they weren't far off. He couldn't afford to. Where the other soldiers fought with brute strength and reflexes, David's weapon was his mind. He had studied the Zorak tactics, memorized their attack patterns, and searched for any exploitable weaknesses. And yet, something was gnawing at him. The Zorak were too quiet, too patient. David moved to a nearby terminal, bringing up the sensor data from the outpost's long-range scanners. There was interference static blocking their readings. He frowned and ran a diagnostic. Nothing was wrong with the equipment. The interference wasn't natural. "They're jamming us," David said, glancing over at K.L. Aaron. "What does that mean?" K.L. Aaron asked, already knowing the answer but hoping to hear something less grim. David didn't sugarcoat it. "It means they're about to attack in force. They don't want us to see them coming." K.L. Aaron cursed under his breath. "How long do we have?" David's eyes moved back to the horizon. A tremor in the ground, almost imperceptible, made his stomach knot. Not long. As if on cue, the first signs of the assault became visible. A black, seething mass appeared on the horizon, undulating like a living wave. The Zorak swarm, millions strong, was coming. Their drone-like warriors were advancing rapidly, their insectoid legs skittering across the rocky ground, their bioorganic weapons glowing a sickly green in the fading light. David's hand shot to his comm: "All units, prepare for incoming." "This is it." The alarm blared throughout the outpost as soldiers scrambled into position. Defensive turrets hummed to life, and energy barriers flickered as they powered up. K.L. Aaron grabbed his heavy plasma rifle and positioned himself behind a makeshift barricade, while Jiro and the others took up positions along the walls. The Thraxian sniper, her body blending into the environment with her natural camouflage, perched high on a rocky outcropping, scanning the advancing horde through her scope. David had seen her pick off Zorak with precision that bordered on superhuman. David sprinted to the command center, where the officers were monitoring the situation. The outpost commander, a grizzled Zetian with cybernetic limbs, barked orders to his troops. "Lieutenant David, report," the commander growled as David approached. "The Zorak are jamming our sensors," David said, his breath coming quickly. "We're blind. They're using this to cover a massive assault." The commander's eyes narrowed. "How massive?" "Everything they've got," David replied. "They're throwing their entire swarm at us." The commander slammed his fist onto the table. "We can't hold off an attack of that scale for long." David's mind raced, piecing together the puzzle. The Zorak wouldn't just throw themselves at the outpost without a strategy. There had to be something more. They were smarter than that, smarter than most people gave them credit for. Then it hit him. The jamming, the swarm, it was a distraction. David's eyes widened. They're not just attacking the outpost. They're going for the command center. The commander frowned. "What are you talking about?" "They're trying to disable our communications," David explained, his voice rising with urgency. "If they take out this command post, we lose our connection to the fleet. They'll isolate us, and then we're done." Realization dawned on the commander's face. "We're the real target." David nodded. "We need to move quickly. We have to stop them before they reach the central hub." The commander didn't hesitate. He slammed his hand on the console, issuing new orders to the entire base. "All units, fall back to the command center. This is a full defensive hold." As the soldiers repositioned, David led a small strike team, including K.L. Aaron and the Thraxian sniper, toward the most vulnerable section of the outpost's defenses. The swarm was closing in fast, a massive wave of chittering, skittering death. But David had a plan. He had studied the Zorak's hive mind long enough to know that while they were efficient, they weren't perfect. The key to their strategy was the command drone, a central unit that coordinated the movements of the entire swarm. If they could take it out, they could disrupt the Zorak's attack long enough to regroup. "Jiro, I need you to get the others ready to hold the line here," David ordered as they reached their position. "K.L. Aaron, with me. We're going to find the command drone." K.L. Aaron nodded, a grim expression on his face. "I'll follow your lead." David activated his tactical visor, scanning the swarm. The command drone wouldn't be far behind the front lines. It would be protected, hidden among the masses. But David knew what to look for. A slight shimmer in the energy signatures, the telltale sign of the drone's bioorganic field generator. There, David pointed, spotting the anomaly. "That's our target." K.L. Aaron followed him without question, blasting through the swarm with brutal efficiency. The Zorak drones fell around them, but they kept coming, wave after wave. It felt like trying to hold back a tide with a single shield. Finally, they reached the command drone. It was massive, a grotesque creature encased in a glowing exoskeleton, hovering just above the ground. The drone's eyes glowed with a cold intelligence, directing the swarm with precise, calculated movements. David didn't hesitate. He raised his weapon and fired, unleashing a concentrated energy burst that struck the drone's core. The creature shrieked, its biofield flickering as it tried to repair itself. K.L. Aaron roared and slammed his plasma rifle into the drone's head, delivering a fatal blow. The effect was immediate. The Zorak swarm faltered, their movements becoming erratic and uncoordinated. The hive mind's control had been severed, and without direction, the drones became disorganized. David fell to one knee, catching his breath as the chaos around them subsided. The Zorak, once an unstoppable force, were now retreating, confused, and leaderless. "You did it," K.L. Aaron said, panting as he surveyed the battlefield. David nodded, too exhausted to respond. The battle was over, but the war was far from won. They had survived another day, but the Zorak would be back. They always were. As the Federation forces regrouped, David knew one thing for certain: this war wasn't just about strength or numbers. It was about strategy, about outthinking the enemy at every turn. And in that, humanity had found its edge. David sat alone in the command post's tactical room, his eyes fixed on the flickering holomap that displayed the vast sectors of the galaxy under siege. Halos 9 had been saved, but the victory felt hollow. The Zorak had retreated, but their departure wasn't a sign of defeat, it was strategy. They never abandoned a fight without reason, and David knew they would return, more deadly and precise than before. The door slid open behind him, and he turned to see Commander Talrin, the grizzled Zetian who led the defense of Halos 9, stepping inside. His cybernetic limbs clicked with each step, and his sharp, mechanical gaze scanned the room before resting on David. "You look like you haven't slept in days, Lieutenant," Talrin said, his voice a blend of synthetic and organic tones. "I haven't," David admitted, his voice flat. His mind had been racing since the battle, running endless simulations in his head, searching for a way to stay ahead of the Zorak. "I've been analyzing the data from the last attack. Something doesn't feel right." Talrin raised an eyebrow. "You just led us through one of the most brutal battles this outpost has ever faced, and you still think something's wrong?" David stood up and walked to the holomap, his fingers tracing the movements of the Zorak fleet. "They weren't just testing us. They were gathering data, learning our defenses, our weaknesses. This retreat's tactical. They're preparing for something bigger." The commander watched him carefully, his metallic fingers tapping rhythmically on the edge of the console. "You've been right about them so far, David. What do you think they're planning?" David's eyes darkened as he stared at the map. A full-scale invasion. They've identified key Federation outposts like Halos 9, and they're coordinating their forces. The next attack won't just be a swarm. It'll be calculated. Surgical. Talrin cursed under his breath. We're stretched thin as it is. The Federation is still recovering from the last wave of invasions. If the Zorak hit us with full force dash, they'll cripple us, David finished, his voice grim. Unless we hit them first. Talrin blinked, taken aback. You're talking about a preemptive strike? David nodded, the weight of the decision heavy on his shoulders. We've been on the defensive this entire war. The Zorak know our tactics, our strategies. But they're still underestimating us in one way. They think we'll always react to them. They don't expect us to strike first. Talrin paced the room, his mechanical joints hissing softly. That's a risky move, Lieutenant. You're suggesting we take the fight to them on their terms. You realize what that means? David nodded. It means we stop waiting for them to outthink us. We hit their hive ship. We cut off their central command, their link to the hive mind. Without it, they're just drones. The room fell silent as Talrin considered the plan. It was bold, reckless even, but it was the kind of strategy that could change the entire course of the war. The Federation had been fighting the Zorak for years, always trying to hold the line, but never gaining ground. This was different. This was a chance to strike at the heart of the enemy. Talrin turned back to David, his expression serious. You think you can pull this off? David met his gaze, determination hardening his features. I know I can. But I'll need a team. Within hours, the strike team had been assembled, an elite unit chosen not for their rank or reputation, but for their unique skills and adaptability. Jiro, the stubborn but resourceful Gamma Squad leader, the Thraxian sniper, whose ability to blend into the environment made her the perfect infiltrator, and, of course, Aaron, the Zeltar warrior who had once mocked David but now stood beside him as a trusted ally. As they gathered around the briefing table, the hologram of the Zorak hive ship rotated slowly in the air. It was massive, a dark, organic structure that pulsed with an eerie green light. The ship served as the nerve center for the entire Zorak swarm in this sector. The objective is simple, David began, his tone steady and authoritative. We get in, we disable the hive mind, and we get out. Once the hive mind is severed, their forces will fall into disarray, giving the Federation time to launch a full-scale counterattack. Jiro folded his arms, his bioluminescent skin glowing faintly in the dim light. And how exactly do we disable the hive mind? It's not like they're going to hand us the keys. David tapped a section of the hologram, zooming in on the core of the hive ship. Here. This is the neural relay. It's a bioorganic structure that links the hive mind to the drones. If we can plant an EMP charge here, it'll short-circuit their entire network. Aaron nodded, his large hands tightening around his plasma rifle. So we get in, blow it up, and hope we survive the fallout. Pretty much, David said with a small smile. It won't be easy. The ship is heavily guarded, and the Zorak will adapt quickly once they know we're inside. But if we can stay ahead of them, we have a shot. The Thraxian sniper, her mandibles clicking softly, spoke for the first time. In and out. I like it. David looked around at his team, the faces of soldiers who had once doubted him, who had once seen him as an outsider. Now, they were putting their lives in his hands. This isn't just about winning a battle, David said, his voice low but firm. This is about ending the war. The infiltration went as planned at first. David's team boarded a stealth shuttle that flew low beneath the Zorak sensors, slipping past their defenses unnoticed. The hive ship loomed before them, a monstrous structure that seemed alive, its surface shifting and writhing as if the ship itself were breathing. As the shuttle docked on the underside of the hive ship, David's pulse quickened. They had made it inside, but the real challenge was just beginning. Moving through the dark, bioorganic corridors of the hive ship was like walking through the belly of a beast. The walls pulsed with a sickly green glow, and the air was thick with the scent of decaying matter. Zorak drones patrolled the hallways, but the team moved silently, avoiding detection. David led them through the maze-like structure, his tactical visor scanning for the neural relay. The map he had studied was incomplete, but his instincts guided him. Time was running out. The Zorak would eventually sense their presence. Finally, they reached the central chamber. The neural relay was there, suspended in the middle of the room, glowing with an eerie energy. It was massive, pulsing with power, an organic machine that controlled the entire Zorak swarm. Jiro knelt by the relay, carefully attaching the EMP charge. "It's set," he whispered. "Just give the word." David nodded, his hand hovering over the detonator. "Everyone, fall back. We have 5 minutes before this place goes dark." Just as they began to retreat, a piercing shriek echoed through the chamber. David's heart dropped. The Zorak had found them. Drones flooded into the room from all directions, their sharp limbs clicking as they moved with terrifying speed. K'Laren roared and opened fire, mowing down the first wave with his plasma rifle. The Thraxian sniper disappeared into the shadows, picking off drones with deadly precision. "Go!" David shouted, his voice barely audible over the chaos. They fought their way back through the corridors, but the Zorak were relentless. David glanced at the countdown timer on his wristcom. 2 minutes left. As they reached the shuttle bay, the drones swarmed closer, their screeches filling the air. K'Laren and Jiro held the line, buying precious seconds as the rest of the team boarded the shuttle. David stayed behind, firing into the horde, his heart racing. "David, let's go!" K'Laren shouted, blasting another drone into pieces. David fired one last shot before sprinting toward the shuttle. He barely made it inside before the door slammed shut, and the shuttle lifted off, speeding away from the hive ship. The EMP charge detonated with a bright flash, and the entire hive ship went dark. The drones below them faltered, their movements becoming erratic. David watched as the Zorak fleet, once an unstoppable force, began to fall apart. He collapsed into his seat, his breath coming in ragged gasps. They had done it. They had severed the hive mind. K'Laren clapped him on the shoulder, his usual gruff expression softened by a rare smile. "You did good, human." David chuckled, exhausted but relieved. "Took all of us to pull it off." As the shuttle flew back toward Federation space, David allowed himself a moment of peace. The war wasn't over, not by a long shot, but this was a victory. A turning point. For the first time, David truly understood what he had become. He wasn't just the outcast recruit anymore. He was something more: a strategist, a leader, and, most importantly, a symbol of what humanity could bring to the galaxy. He stared out the window at the stars beyond, the weight of his journey pressing down on him. The Galactic Federation would never look at humans the same way again. They had underestimated him once. They wouldn't make that mistake again. And neither would the Zorak.